The night smelled of rot and old bandages, as I broke open the heavy iron gates of Beelitz Haustatten. The sanatorium lay there like a dying colossus in the Brandenburg glade, a skeleton of brick and decay. The windows, black like empty eye sockets that had been watching me for miles. The walls were choked by ivy, as if nature wanted to bury the sins of this place under green flesh. I had planned for months. Every detail, every camera angle. My channel needed this success. The clicks were at rock bottom. But I didn't just want a simple urbex video. No running teenagers or faked ghost voices. I wanted the legend that the old gods only spoke of in whispers when they were drunk. That something is waiting here. Something ancient that loves the silence. Something that is hungry for people who stand still. 25 people had come. A dark procession through the forest, summoned via encrypted channels on the darknet. No names, no faces, only hoods and the cold glow of smartphone displays. We entered the old operating room in the surgery wing. The plaster hung in tatters from the ceiling like dead skin. In the center stood the table, a massive monster of cast iron and enamel, cold, relentless. I took off my shirt. My skin immediately formed goosebumps in the frozen air of the hall. Upon it lay the objects, neatly lined up like instruments for a holy mass. On one side, the symbols of innocence. A rose, a jar of honey, expensive perfume, a soft feather. On the other side, a rusty scalpel, a syringe with an unknown, yellowish liquid, a thick hemp rope, a heavy chain, and the old Wehrmacht pistol, a Luger, black and heavy. A single cartridge sat in the chamber, a metallic promise. The rule was absolute. I was the silent body, an object, flesh without will. They were the free hands. They were allowed to do everything. Everything. Exactly 9 p.m. The digital timer on the wall began to count. The red glow of the digits was the only constant light. I stood barefoot on the cold stone floor. It felt like the ice of a frozen lake. I felt the cold slowly crawling up my ankles, then the knees, like invisible, icy fingers wanting to pull me down. It smelled of ammonia, of dust, and of that one smell that you never forget, something sweetish, like burnt flesh that has been stuck in the cracks of the tiles for decades. The first spectator stepped out of the darkness. We called him the doctor. He wore an old plague mask, eyes hidden behind glass. He picked up the scalpel. He looked at the rusty blade in the pale moonlight falling through the broken roof. He stepped very close to me. I could hear his irregular breath. I felt the ice-cold blade on my chest. First gently, an almost tender caress. Then, a sudden tear. A thin red line opened on my skin. It took seconds for the pain to come. I watched the blood run over my stomach. It was so hot compared to the room temperature. Steaming. Dark. I didn't move a muscle. I breathed shallowly. I showed no pain. That was the pact. But in the eyes of the spectators, I saw something break. Civilization, morality, decency. Everything slipped off them like a dirty, old skin. Then, the first sound from outside the circle. Scratch. Long silence. Scratch. Scratch. It came from the walls, from the deep, black corridors behind the heavy oak door. It wasn't rats. Rats sound hectic. This sounded rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like fingernails running over dry bones. A spectator swore softly and took a step back. But no one left the room. Greed was stronger than fear. The doctor laughed under his mask. A dry, hollow sound. He took the pistol. He pressed the ice-cold barrel directly against my temple. I felt the hard steel. Click. The metallic sound of the empty strike echoed through the massive building like a whip crack. The air suddenly became heavier, thicker, as if the sanatorium itself took a deep breath and pulled us all into its lungs. And deep in my head, where my own thoughts normally lived, I heard a voice. It was foreign. It was ancient. It sounded like shattering glass. Finally, it whispered, "Someone who truly stands still." I wanted to run away. Every nerve in my body screamed for flight. My instinct roared at me. But my body no longer belonged to me. It felt heavy as lead, like stone. I stood rooted to the bloody floor, and out there in the darkness of the corridors, the shadows came closer. They flitted along the walls, faster than human eyes could follow. The first hour was over. The red light of the timer jumped to 5 hours. And the game, the real game, had only just begun. The third hour was the turning point. The atmosphere in the operating room had completely transformed. It was no longer a performance. It was a ritual slaughter of sanity. The lights flickered now in an unnatural rhythm. It wasn't the generator outside in the forest. No. Something deep in the foundation was tearing at the cables. Something no longer wanted to remain in the dark. The doctor stepped forward again. He set the scalpel aside and took the heavy hunting knife. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he placed the tip on my collarbone. He carved symbols into my chest. No words that I knew. They were archaic lines. Symbols for pain. Symbols for a door. I felt the hot blood flowing in thick streams over my upper body, soaking my black trousers. My skin burned as if liquid lead were being poured into the wounds. But my face remained a mask of stone. The rule was now my absolute prison. I couldn't blink. I couldn't swallow. Luna suddenly stepped out of the circle of shadows. In her hands, she held the syringe. She didn't tremble. She placed the needle directly against my carotid artery. I felt the tiny prick. "What if I do it now?" she asked in a whisper. Her voice was no longer the voice of a young woman. It sounded like the crackling of old parchment. It sounded like the rattling breath of the patients who had died of consumption within these cursed walls over 100 years ago. The doctor laughed softly. But it wasn't a laugh of joy. It sounded like a suppressed sob. One of the spectators in the background suddenly began to cry. He didn't cover his face. He just stared at me. Thick, black blood ran from his tear sacs. He didn't wipe it away. He smiled at me with bad teeth. The scratching was now everywhere. In the walls behind us. In the floor directly beneath my feet. In my own ribs. It sounded as if the entire sanatorium was taking a deep breath. A giant, lung-diseased colossus. The air became so thick that you could almost chew it. It tasted of old iron, of burnt hair, of the sweat of the dying. I could no longer think clearly. My thoughts were no longer my own. They mingled with the screams of the past. More, a voice inside me thought. Give them more. Let them bleed. Let them all bleed. But I knew that wasn't me. It was exactly 0:30. The doctor picked up the Luger again. But he no longer held it against my head. He turned the weapon around. He held the barrel under his own chin. "Maybe the bullet is for me," he said with a voice that sounded like a hollow echo. His eyes were now completely black. No white. No iris. Just two deep holes leading into infinity. He cocked the hammer. The metallic click was the loudest sound in the universe. Click. Again, an empty chamber. The other spectators didn't scream with relief. They stared in disappointment. They waited hungrily for the bloodbath. I felt my own heartbeat getting slower and slower. Boom. Boom. The cold in my chest spread like ice water in my veins. My fingers wanted to twitch. Every fiber of my being wanted to knock the weapon out of his hand. But I stood still. I was a statue of flesh and pain. The rule was now stronger than my instinct for survival. Or was it already something else that had taken control over my muscles? The voice in my head became a marrow-shattering roar. Stand still. Be still. They belong to me now. Luna stepped forward and kissed the fresh cuts on my chest. Her mouth was colder than the stone floor. "It is in you," she whispered directly into my ear. "You called it. Now it is finally home." The spectators began to move rhythmically. They swayed back and forth. Not like humans. Like marionettes whose strings are being pulled from the ceiling by an unseen, insane hand. One of the men took the coarse hemp rope from the table. He tied it into a perfect noose around his own neck. He pulled it tight. His face turned dark blue. The veins on his temples stood out like thick earthworms. He smiled at me while he slowly suffocated. I wanted to scream. "Stop. This isn't a video anymore. This isn't an experiment." But my mouth was sealed as if with pitch. My legs were as if cast in concrete. And in my eyes, a foreign light began to burn. A cold, violet glow. The spectators suddenly backed away. The malicious grins gave way to naked horror. The doctor whispered with lips trembling with fear. "It is him. The guardian of the sanatorium. He has awakened." The scratching in the walls became a deafening thunder, as if the building were about to collapse. And then, suddenly, silence. Absolute, deadly silence. The fourth hour began. The red of the timer reflected in the black eyes of those present. And I knew I was no longer the performer. I had become the gate. And the thing on the other side had just set its first foot through. The last hour was no longer a struggle. It was a solemn handover, a capitulation of reality. At exactly 2 o'clock, I moved for the first time. Not because my brain gave the command, but because the darkness in my veins pulled the strings. My hand rose. Inch by inch. It felt as if I were moving my arm through thick tar. I took the scalpel from the table. The metal vibrated in my hand as if it were alive. The spectators backed away. The circle broke open. Their black eyes were now wide open. No more greed. Only naked, animal fear. Not the fear that one seeks for an adrenaline kick, but the fear that one feels when one realizes that there is no after anymore. My body glided through the room. I no longer felt the floor. It was as if I were floating above the pain. Within me was a deep, satisfying, ice-cold silence. The voice was now mine. But it didn't come from my throat. It came from the walls themselves. "You have broken the silence," I said. Every word sounded like the shattering of frozen glass. It was the echo of 100 years of solitude and death. "Now, take it back. Become part of it." The doctor tried to crawl toward the heavy oak door. He tore at the handle. But the shadows in the corners of the operating room became liquid. Long, spindly hands of pure darkness shot forth. They clawed into his flesh and pulled him with superhuman strength back into the blackness beneath the instrument cabinets. He wanted to scream. but the scream was choked in the bud. All that remained was the familiar, rhythmic scratching. Luna fell to her knees. Black blood now seeped from her ears and her mouth. "Please," she whispered. This was only for the video. Only for the art. I leaned down to her. My face was so close to hers that she must have felt the cold radiating from me. The scalpel glided over her cheek. A razor-thin cut. There was no more pain. It was a marking. "You watched," I said quietly. "You enjoyed every moment. Just like all the others. Just like you, who are watching this video right now." The heavy door to the hall slammed shut on its own. A thundering bang that banished the outside world forever. The remaining spectators tried to plead, but their voices lost their substance. They became quieter, thinner, until they sounded only like the rustling of dry leaves. One by one, they were sucked up by the walls. They became silhouettes on the old plaster. Not dead. No. Only still. Fixed forever in their horror. I returned to my place. I picked up the Wehrmacht pistol again. The last cartridge was no longer in the chamber. It was now in the air. It was in the silence itself. The cameras on the walls hummed quietly on. Their red lights were like the eyes of small demons. They recorded everything. They captured the moment the boundary fell. Soon the video will be uploaded. And the world will see it. Just as you are doing now. The timer beeped. Midnight. The 6 hours were over. But the performance, the true performance, has only just begun. I looked directly into the lens of the main camera. I smiled. The smile felt like a scar tearing open again after years. And now, while you sit here and suck these words into yourself, do you feel it too? The scratching behind your wallpaper. The sudden drop in temperature in your room. The dark figure at the edge of your field of vision that disappears when you turn your head. You watched the whole time. You did not interrupt the silence. You were a perfect audience. You accepted the invitation. And this place never forgets an invitation. I am no longer the man from the beginning. I am the guardian. The eternal body of this sanatorium. And you are my next performance. Do you hear that? Don't turn around. Welcome to the silent performance. There is no more escape. There is only the silence. And it has already touched you.